Alrighty, so tonight we're going to talk about pruning and all the reasons why you would want to prune, um, why you should, maybe why you shouldn't. There's all different reasons why you should prune a shrub or a tree. Some of them, like this, are pretty elaborate and take a lot of effort to maintain a very formal garden like this. And some are just kind of rambling and natural and definitely work in whatever landscape you have. So this is just kind of a way to kind of express the different types of pruning, why you would want to, choosing a natural versus a highly managed landscape, and just to learn a little bit more about the different techniques to see, just as maybe you don't know anything at all about pruning, and that is fine. This is a perfectly acceptable class for this. You'll learn a lot of new information on that. And maybe if you're already a gardener and you've been out there doing pruning and enjoying your gardening and you wanted to learn a little bit more intermediate, this is that. And also, even if you're an expert, you'll probably come away with hopefully a few new bits of information and technique. My buttons are a little button happy today. Okay, so why are you going to prune? Well, we're always going to prune with a purpose. So sometimes we see, you know, things on the side of the road like crepe myrtle, and we'll talk about crepe myrtle later in the presentation. Basically, some of you may know what that is. That's where people go through and they just hack the top of their crepe myrtles off, and you know, they look so sad. And as an extension professional, that's something that we try to educate folks and say, please don't do that. Crepe myrtles are great plants and they, are very pretty. And sometimes, people just get stuck in that mindset of that's the thing that we've got to do. But that's not the case. So you always want to know why you're pruning. Here we have some azaleas. So not everything gets pruned at the same time of year. Some things will get pruned in the summer after they're done flowering. Some things get pruned in the middle of winter or towards the end of winter, early spring. Um, there are just different reasons for why you're going to want to prune things at certain times of the year. There are some standouts. So these are a couple of examples of when you can prune any time of year. So generally, like I said, there's a time and a place. You're not just going to prune, you know, willy-nilly, if you will, whenever you get a wild hair to do that, except in certain situations. So you can see here on the left, we have a couple of branches that have grown together and they are rubbing on each other. That's one that if you see that, go ahead and prune away. And that is because every plant, be it a tree or a bush or a flower, they all have an immune system just like we do. And the easiest thing to kind of, I guess, use as an analogy is that as we, for instance, let's say that, I skinned up my arm really bad because I fell down. Well, that's going to open up a wound and I might get, an infection, right? So the same thing can happen to that tree or that bush or that flower if those branches rub together like that. That opens up a wound on the surface of that branch or trunk. So we don't want that, obviously. And we live in Atlanta, the Atlanta area. A lot of us do, but just Georgia in general. It is a soupy, humid mess here in the summer, and we really don't want all of the fungal spores, bacterium that are floating around out there, all the wet that we have. We just don't want to give those disease-causing organisms any extra oomph. So if you see something like that, go ahead and plan on pruning that. And we'll talk about the proper techniques for pruning. If you have storm damage, like you see on the right, could be an ice storm, could be a tornado, some wind events. If you get some damage like this, and you can see up at the very tippy top of these trees, looks like ice damage, that's a very ragged break. And that is perfect for disease-causing organisms to get in there. So in situations where you have something like that to happen, you definitely want to prune. It doesn't matter the time of year. It's going to be way better to get in there and clean that up so that so you have a clean cut, and that tree can hopefully heal itself, which trees have the ability to heal themselves. A lot of people don't realize that. They just think, hey, I've got this tree in my backyard, but actually they do. They have um, a compartmentalization process where if they have a broken branch or you go in and you trim them, they have the ability to actually wall off that damage to help protect themselves, much like you do when you form a scab on your skin. So it's kind of neat, that whole process and how it happens. And but yeah, go ahead and plan on pruning in these two situations, most definitely. So why else would you want to prune? Well, to improve flowering and fruiting. So sometimes you have foundation plantings, like you have an old azalea here to the left. They get big and they might get some unwieldy branches. You may want to invigorate that plant. And so you may go in and try to prune out some of the older wood and get some of the newer wood in there so that you can get some more flowers. Maybe you have some grapevines out there, so muscadine vines or something else. And, you do have to prune those pretty regularly in order to get the types of fruits that you want. So everybody, if you're going to put the time and the energy and the investment into planting a fruit and maintaining it, you should probably know how to do that. One of the nice things about working for Extension is that we get all sorts of good training opportunities. So next week, I get to go and over to Watkinsville and an all-day grapevine pruning demonstration. So we get some of the experts from the university to come out, talk about viticulture, and teach us how to prune multiple different types of grapevines, which is kind of cool. So, but that's going to be another reason why you want to do that, because the plant itself does better when it's pruned and it'll produce more fruit. Why else? Well, controlling natural sizes and shapes, and also for safety and visibility. So here's some more examples. If you're in suburbia and you have sidewalks, not all the time are people going to plant uh, trees or shrubs or hedges or things like that that fit into the area in which they're planted. So you can see these areas to the left, they're pretty overgrown, aren't they? Would you want to walk down that sidewalk? I've walked down sidewalks like that before. It's really annoying when you have to duck all the time because somebody hasn't bothered to come in and prune and maintain the plants that are in their yard. I understand there's a need for privacy, and some people kind of like that wild and rambling look, but on that sidewalk side, that's actually a hazard because nobody wants to walk into that. You see over there on the right, you've got, looks like lilacs, which unfortunately we don't have here, but uh, lilacs can get very, rambling and unwieldy. And so with some pruning, you can actually improve the flowering of them. And in this case, since they're using them as a hedge, you want to make sure that it's pruned such that you're not blocking windows or anything else. Obviously, that's happening here. It's blocking windows, and that goes for the front of your house too. So if you have an older home, maybe in a subdivision that's, I don't know, 10 years old, 15, 20 years old, a lot of those foundation plantings they put into the front of those houses, in front of your bay windows or your other windows, may now be quite large. They may cover up half the window. And that's actually not a good thing. We don't want that because of safety reasons. So that gives somebody a place to hide if they're trying to break in. So in cases like that, we might want to do some renewal pruning, and we'll talk about that later. Why else? Well, diseases, obviously. So some of these plants that I'm showing here, these are, look to be lelands. Lelands can get a lot of diseases. Sometimes you can prune out those areas and save the tree. Sometimes you can't. But this is just an example. But maybe you have some fire blight going on. You want to prune out that section and maybe get that out of there. Some trees, it's limited to just that one particular branch. Sometimes, you're lucky and you can get in there and prune that out, disinfect your pruners, and then, you're okay. So if you have disease, that would be another reason why you would want to prune. Here's an example of a cryptomeria, or Japanese cedar. These guys are really beautiful and they have a nice conical structure. So shape is a lot of times the reason why people want to prune. They're trying to force the whole square peg in the round hole thing. I teach shrub ID and selection for a master gardener class, and that one talks about how you can choose plants that naturally have that shape. So you don't have to do as much pruning and as much shaping. Maybe you want something that's smaller, choose something that fits in that area. Don't try to shove the square peg in the round hole. Choose something that's going to fit and look nice there without a ton of maintenance. All right, so 3 T's for proper pruning: tools and using the correct technique. That is important. And pruning at the right time. I mentioned earlier that timing is everything. Some things that, especially that flower, you want to, if they bloom on old wood, you need to make sure that you're pruning right after they're done blooming so that there's time for that wood to then grow out and mature, and then it's ready for the next season. So a lot of questions we get is often, why is my hydrangea not blooming anymore? Well, sometimes it's simply you're pruning it at the wrong time. So we have to kind of go through and figure out what kind of hydrangea it is, or, maybe it's a rose or something else. But using the right tools, using the correct technique, and pruning at the right time. Those are the 3 T's. So here's some examples of different types of pruning tools. You have a bow saw. That's going to be something that you're going to use on a small branch. Hedge shears. So if you've got some hollies that form a hedge between you and your neighbor with the annoying dogs, this will be something that you'll use to kind of, you can use electric shears, of course, but if you like the old-fashioned way, this will be how you do it. Lopping shears, that's to get individual branches. The arms are a little bit longer, so you can kind of reach down in there. You might use a pruning saw with that D grip. That just needs one hand, and you can kind of get your arm in there and saw away. A combination pole and saw pruner, that's going to be for taller branches, ones up over your head. Pruning saw with a crescent grip, again, similar to the D grip. That's going to allow you to kind of get in there and really saw with the one hand. And then the folding saw, that's more of a portable one. And then you've got your pruners. Anvil pruners are more for dead branches, dead wood, because it really will crimp that end, and that will damage a living branch. So we really just tell you use an anvil pruner if it's dead wood. But those scissor action pruners or bypass, those are usually the ones that are most often used for everything from a rose bush to an evergreen to cut flowers out of your garden for a vase in your house. So here's some pole pruners. They come in different styles, if you will. Some have telescoping handles. Some are just solid wood. All sorts of different kinds. Very useful. You can get up over your head, pretty far up there, and take off branches up to 15, 20 feet, kind of depending on how tall you are. I have one. It's very useful. No one likes hitting their head on branches as they're going around cutting the grass. So this will help you right there so that doesn't happen. Keeping your tools sharp is a very, very important thing. So I mentioned the anvil pruners and why we're not really a big fan of those except for dead wood, and that's because it crimps the tissue. It can damage the tissue. So can using very dull pruners. It can kind of crimp and damage the tissue as well. So here you just have an example of sharpening your blades. You want to make sure that your blades are kept sharpened and in good shape. And that also means don't leave them out in the rain. I think we've probably all done that. We go out to do some work and for whatever reason, set them down and forget about them. And then we're out gardening a few days later and it's rained and they're rusty and you're like, oh, geez, especially if you spent a lot of money for them. I have all different types. Sometimes you have folks that buy the really expensive ones. I don't typically do that. I buy medium priced ones, and if I can find some deals, and I have a lot of them all around. I have a very hilly yard. So sometimes it's nice to have some in the backyard and a shed and some in the front yard so I don't have to go too far. But either way, it doesn't matter if it's a $10 pair or a $50 pair. Just take care of them. Make sure you keep them sharp, make sure you keep them oiled and in good condition because ultimately that's what's going on your plants and you don't want to do any damage by not maintaining your tools. So the basic principle of pruning is most of that regrowth is going to occur within about 6 to 8 inches of the cut of that particular cut that you just did. So that's due to apical dominance, and the information that I'm giving you here is mostly because of, I guess, how the tree or bush responds and what you personally are looking for. So we all can probably remember, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago when they started doing the whole meatball shrub thing. And I'm not a fan. It's a lot of extra work, especially when you can find bushes or shrubs that have that kind of natural rounded appearance. But this wasn't that. This is, trying to shove the square peg in the round hole again. When you cut off in an area, let's say you're rounding off a shrub, it's going to grow that 6 to 8 inches with the cut. So you're constantly going to get new growth from that cut. Well, eventually, as that tree or shrub grows, the interior of that is going to lose a lot of its leaves and it's not going to have a lot going on in there. It's just going to be like a big old empty ball. And so sometimes if you end up with a damaged shrub due to frost damage or freeze damage, or maybe somebody runs into it with a car, or who knows what, you end up with an interesting look that isn't exactly what you meant to happen because all the growth has been happening on the outside, not on the inside. So there are things you can do to fix that. But generally speaking, we're not a big fan of what we call header pruning, which is what that is. So you can see here's a little bit of plant biology. You've got a terminal bud up at the top. You've got your nodes, a lateral bud on the side, and a bud scar. So you can see, and most people have noted this when you're out there, if you're pruning or shaping or whatever, your current season's growth, which is typically going to be past that bud scar, and your previous season's growth. The new season will typically be not as woody. It'll be maybe green. It's very obvious what it is. So you just kind of want to make a note of that. And when you're doing your pruning, you're going to prune right around those bud areas. Some trees and some shrubs are going to be alternating. Some are going to be right across from each other. It's kind of an art, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, if you're pruning, because a lot of it is by eye. So, again, some of the calls we get are people who have really old and frumpy looking landscaping and they're kind of wondering, should I rip everything out or should I start over from scratch? And the question really depends. If you like the particular type of plants, we can help you shape those and renew them so that they look nice, and then teach you how to properly maintain them so they don't ever get that big and unwieldy again. Or you may want new stuff, and that's okay too. So here you have a bit of a more close-up of a node. So you've got your leaf and your leaf node, and you can see there's another bud, the lateral bud there, excuse me, and a leaf scar from where the leaf fell out the previous year, and the bud scale scar. So you just want to make note that those lateral buds, those are, you're going to end up pruning around there. So making a cut. So this is a little bit of an older presentation. I will probably go in and completely revamp it. But for now, this will work. So here you can kind of see the proper way to cut versus the improper way to cut. So to the left, for A, you have the correct way to do it. So it's going to be just above that bud, and you're going to do it on an angle. And you do it on an angle because you don't want water or anything else to kind of settle there. You want it to kind of slope and run off. The wrong ways to do it. So B, you have too much of an angle. C, you have too far from the bud. So when that bud starts to grow, what you're doing is changing the apical dominance of that particular branch. So the way plants typically grow is they're going to grow up, right? And then you'll have some branches, they'll come off like this. So when you're pruning, you're actually taking off that tip and creating a new one, in effect. So that plant is still going to grow. It's just going to grow in whatever direction you're training it to grow. So if you're trying to get some height off of it and you don't want it to grow up, then you're going to train it to grow out, right? So the wrong way, you can see there on C, it's too far from the bud. So that bud is then going to take on the apical dominance and it's going to start growing and you're going to get a branch, but then you're going to have this little nubbin that is there and doing nothing. And it looks silly, especially if you have a longer one. And I think we can all say we've seen that. There's a lot of utility pruning that's going on around right now. I've seen it recently all over Gwinnett County. And those utility pruners, a lot of them, I'm not going to call out names, they should know better, but they're basically just lopping off the branch. A lot of them don't care if they're getting it close to a node. They just don't care. They're just lopping it off and, in whatever the right of way is. And that's not the correct way to do it. It wouldn't take them any more time to do it the correct way, but they're not doing that. So, but anyway, so you can see there's too far from the bud, and that's typically how utility pruners will do it, so that it's just kind of jutting off there out into space with nothing. It's just an ugly branch. And I'll go into why you don't want to do that in a little bit. And then you can also get too close to the bud. So if you get too close to the bud, you can damage it, and then it's not actually going to grow, or it's going to grow and it's going to be an odd growth pattern. And ultimately, what you end up with is C, where it's too far from the bud because it may actually not even grow. And then you have that really weird nubbin that's still sticking out there. So stick with A, which is just above the bud on a slight angle, and you won't go wrong. So here's kind of a description of how you want to do it. So always make sure that whatever you're doing, pruning either in a shrub or a tree, that you're always going to cut back to a bud. All right. So that bud is going to assume that apical dominance, and it's going to grow in whatever direction it's facing. You always want to make sure that if you're going to trim a lateral branch off the main trunk, and you don't want to leave a stub. So we'll go into the 3-step cut, and I'll explain there why you're doing that. When you're cutting back to a main branch, especially on a tree, but even on a shrub, it's very important that you don't go too far in. You want to leave just a little bit out there because you don't want to damage the tissue around that. Shrubs, trees, doesn't matter. As I mentioned before, they have the ability to close those wounds, literally. But if you cut in too far, you remove that ability of the tree to do that. And what happens then is that you open that branch up, or the tree or the shrub, whichever it is, to being infested with some type of disease organism because it can't heal itself. So just like if you were to, let's say that you cut yourself really deep or gouged yourself or something, and they had to do a skin graft, same thing here, except you can't do a skin graft for a tree or a bush. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the different types of pruning earlier. So this is a little bit more, we'll go into a little bit more in depth. So you have thinning, and then you have heading. So the meatball shrubs that I talked about that were really popular about 20, 25 years ago, you're using a heading technique. So you can see here, you have the structural branches in there, And then you have the outer lying branches. And then because of the fact that you've been taking hedge pruners or, electric pruners and just basically shearing off the outer new growth to keep it looking nice and manicured, that tree continues to grow up, but at the same time, you're taking off that top couple inches of new growth and there's nothing inside anymore. So it looks really empty on the interior. Um, it's not the best thing to do. I mean, I'm not a fan of it. I know there are still a lot of people that do it. And, English gardens, that very formal look, that's, one of the techniques that's used to kind of keep those hedges looking nice and boxy. And that picture that I showed you earlier with all the funny shapes that had been pruned, that's essentially what's going on there. Now, if you have an older landscape and maybe you have a particular bush that you really wish wasn't 8 feet tall, but you don't want to get rid of it because maybe you get some pretty flowers like a viburnum or something like that, you can come in and you can thin. And you could do this over a season or a couple of years. It depends on how obvious you want it to be. So if you don't mind, you can kind of get in there and give it a pretty hefty prune to thin it out. And then it'll, of course, send up some new shoots down from the next node. Or you can do it over the process of a couple years, and it becomes a lot less obvious that's happening. You can even go so far as a renewal prune. I'm trying to remember if there's any in here on that. So if you have a very tall, very unwieldy looking, let's say gardenia, that's a foundation planting, you can actually take that down to about 18 inches. Yes, even if you have branches that are, 2 inches in diameter, you can take it down to about 18 inches, 2 feet, maybe, I don't know, something like that. You're going to do that at the beginning of the season. It's going to look horrible. But by the end of the season, you will probably have 6 to 8 inches of new growth on those roots. There's a lot of nutrients stored in that root system. And so you have plenty of nutrients in there to go ahead and get that next flush of growth. So if you're looking to take some foundation plantings down to more reasonable size, that is definitely a technique that we can recommend. You just have to make sure that you do it earlier in the season. Don't do it right before you're going into winter. Here's an example of one of those lovely meatballs. Not a fan. Because here's what happens. So after you do all that trimming, let's just say this one happened to be right off the road. Somebody flew off the road, hit your shrub, your bush, took out half of it. You can very clearly see here what happened. You see all those really wiry looking branches in there, and then it's got a little tuft like a donkey tail or something in there. That's what happens to your shrub. It's not going to recover from that. So your options here are you basically can go do a renewal prune, take it down to about 2 feet, and then allow it. And that's only on certain types, not always all of them. But it's going to take a while. It's not going to grow back to this size for probably a decade or decade and a half. This is an older foundation planting. So just be aware of that. There's a reason why we're not a big fan of heading pruning. Oops. And here's another example of an improper pruning job. So I'm going to give this person props because it's right next to the sidewalk. And obviously those pictures I showed you earlier, that person was not doing anything to try to maintain the trees and shrubs on their sidewalk. This person is, but they've really just butchered this shrub and taken off all the branches on that particular side, and it looks horrible. There's nothing there. So this is not really the answer either. Just make sure that if you're going in and you're going to be planting some foundation plantings close to a sidewalk or a street area, that you keep in mind what the mature size of that plant is going to be. Right plant, right place. We use that all the time. And that's why, because you want to make sure whatever you're putting in that spot, it will actually fit in that spot. Nobody wants to go out there and do tons of extra yard work. If you'd chosen something wisely on the front end, you wouldn't have to worry about it on the back end. So here's the wrong plant. So here we have, at some point, these shrubs were probably, your typical meatball shrubs, but you can see how they're starting to encroach size-wise along that brick home. Thankfully, they didn't plant the tallest ones in front of the window there, but what should have been a shorter looking shrub is now kind of odd looking. It looks almost like it's trying to become a tree, a small tree, but it's not. It's actually a shrub that you can actually take down and do a renewal prune on it. A lot of people don't want to do that because it looks really bad. You're going to get some nasty grams from the HOA. So some people might just opt to either rip that out, put some new foundation planting in. One solution we do have is that you can actually go in and do the renewal prune in the back part of the shrub. So you take it down to about 2 feet in the back part that nobody sees because it's against the house. And then by this time next year, you can go in and you've got that growth already back there, judiciously prune back the front part. And if you need to, some of the branches that are there, you can kind of leave them. But that's a 2-year plan on how to prune something that was kind of overgrown and try to get it to fit in your landscape. And here's an example of someone who's shaping a shrub. This is, or thinning, if you will. And you can totally do that. You don't need to just that. Now I mentioned a renewal prune. That's obviously the most I don't, what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, the harshest type of pruning that you can do. This is where you're just taking down select branches. It's almost an artwork because you literally have to take a branch out and then you have to step back and kind of look at it and then go back and remove another one. And then you step back and you're just kind of looking at it, trying to figure out which branches need to be removed. It's something that if you are not really adept at or comfortable with, go ahead and hire somebody to do it. You can, I mean, we all laugh because at some point, if we're a girl, maybe we had Barbies. If we were a boy, maybe we tried to cut our own hair. I know my son did. I cut my Barbie's hair, but sometimes you start taking it down and you're like, oh, I'll take a little bit more. I'll take a little bit more. I'll take a little bit more. And before you know it, you've taken way too much and it looks funny, right? We've all been there, I'm sure, with something. So if you're not comfortable, there's no shame in hiring somebody to do that. There are plenty of landscape companies out there that are happy to do that kind of thing for you. If you can get one that has a certified arborist on staff and they've had some training, that's even better. I say that because there are a lot of companies out there that say, "Oh yeah, we can trim your trees, we can trim your bushes." They're along the same lines as those utility companies that go in and just hack the branch off so that you just have a dead end of the branch there. You want to make sure that whoever you hire is actually competent to do that. So if let's say you've moved into a new house, you have a lot of overgrown foundation plantings, you'd really love to have a company come in and take care of that for you. Ask for some references. Don't be afraid to drive by and take a look at a house to see how they've maintained it. Okay. Here's another hedge that's starting to regrow after it was really hacked back. And you can see the new growth that's on there. So it does regrow. You just have to be willing to wait for it. Pruning hedges, here's some examples of the right way versus the wrong way. We've all seen the flat top hedge, and that's not the right way to do it. You want to kind of shape the entire thing. Looks much better and will continue to look much better. You don't want the other way. So this is not the best example of what to do for a hedge. So if you keep in mind the previous picture I just showed you and how you typically do, you can see here, this is a flat top. This is not what we recommend. It's a little tall and you can see underneath it. generally speaking, when we're looking at a hedge that we don't want anybody to see through or be able to get through, it's going to have leaves all the way to the ground. And here you can very obviously see that there's daylight underneath. So this is not the best way to do it. So this Burford holly, it was pruned very formally, and it remained dense and thick all the way through to the base. So it's a little flat on top, I get it, but they did do an excellent job of forming it into a hedge. So this is more what it should look like. This is improper pruning again. You can see that the one on the left is very sad looking. The one on the right looks like a haircut. And then here's proper crepe myrtle pruning, so not crepe murder. Is this the crepe murder one? Oh, no, that's the next one. Sorry about that. Yeah, so before pruning and after pruning. You can see the one on the top left, it's got a few too many branches, and that is not good in itself because it kind of decreases the airflow. Crepe myrtles kind of have a very dense growth pattern, and so that can, if you have some of the older types of crepe myrtles, say you have an older home, it may be more susceptible to powdery mildew, and having the branches that thick will decrease the airflow. So you want to get in there and prune out some of those branches. Now they're very vigorous growers, so it will definitely be perfectly fine for the next growing season. But it's okay to get in and do an aggressive prune on it initially when you're training it. And you may do that for a couple of years, but then once it gets more to its mature size, you don't really need to do a lot to it. If you are unmuted, please mute yourself. Thank you. So improper pruning. We see this all over the place. Landscape groups will come in and they probably don't know why they're doing it. They're just told that's what you do. It's called crepe murder, folks, and we're not big fans of it. Not only is it ugly, but that plant then is more susceptible year after year to diseases and pests. So last year was a really bad year for figs and ambrosia beetles. A lot of people lost their figs. Typically, it's crepe myrtles that the ambrosia beetles are going to really hit hard. And that's because every year we hack off so much, their poor root system can't keep up. So it's constantly trying to send out new shoots and make up for the branches that were cut off the year before. So try not to do that. We don't want to see this. We're much happier when you have a nicely shaped crepe myrtle with some height on it, and then you get some new growth up at the top. The one on the right is very close to pollarding, and that's done a lot over in the UK. And there's a reason for that, but that's not here. We don't do that with crepe myrtles. So just don't do this, folks. And this is what I was talking about. So this is our ambrosia beetle. If you go out to your crepe myrtle or your fig or any other number of plants and you see these little toothpicks that are kind of protruding from the trunk, and that will be up until like June. If you see these, that's not good. That is a sign that you have ambrosia beetles, which are the little brown beetle that you see right there. And they are attracted to plants that are impacted by something. So last year, because we had that freeze, figs got hit really hard. So we had kind of a double whammy, an early freeze and then a slightly later one. They were sending out leaves and they got whacked really hard. And that kind of opened up a window for the ambrosia beetle. So all across the metro area, it was like Armageddon for figs. The nice thing is they do not burrow into the root system, so people were able to go in and essentially do a renewal prune on their figs. They took them down to just above the root system, and then they were getting regrowth. So just make sure that you burn the wood or get it off your property. But yeah, so thankfully, I think people will still have figs this year. But again, if you do crepe murder to your crepe myrtles, this probably will be what happens in the end. So this is, again, an example of what natural growth looks like, and you're certainly welcome to train them so that they look like this in the earlier years. This looks very nice. You can get around the base of them, nicely mulched, that kind of thing. And this is what they look like when they're grown out, before they bloom. Very pretty. And again, correct pruning. And now is basically when you would do that. So as we move into mid-February and the end of February, we're pretty much safe from any of those really super harsh freezes. We did have a later one last year, but usually by the end of mid to end of February, you can start doing some pruning on them to shape them. It's okay to do that. Here's an example of how to do that if you're thinning it. If you want to thin it down to just some main branches, main trunks, this is what you do. And you need to be careful. You don't want to do this too late into the plant's life because they will sucker like nobody's business. So just be very careful that if you are doing this on maybe a plant that you moved into a new home and not much had been done to it, if it's older, it's probably going to sucker from the root system. So better to do this when it's younger. And here's some just graphics of renewal pruning and the regrowth. So you can see what I was meaning there. And again, just kind of hammering home, this is what it looks like, and it will regrow pretty quickly. But you want to do it before fall. You want to do it right after it's usually May, June is when you'll start seeing all of that leaf out. So start pruning before that. And here's a good example of what happens for renewal pruning. So here they did a really heavy prune, and that's what your landscaping is going to look like. So just be prepared. It's going to be really ugly, but then that's what you have after the fact. And it looks a lot better when it finally grows out and fills out. And here's an example of a severe prune. And why you don't want to do that here. So of note, we've talked about doing renewal prunes. You can't do that with conifers. This is what happens. I drive by some every day on the way to work. Somebody made the mistake of planting lelands under a power line. And I think it's off Cali still in the middle of the county. And they planted lelands and it got too tall and the utility company just came through and just hacked them all off. And this is what they look like. It's sad, looks really stupid. So don't, and again, right plant, right place. Planting these guys under utility lines is not a good place. It's not, just don't do that. And this is what it looks like if you've got a really old juniper. Again, junipers don't do well when you prune them. You cannot renewal prune these guys. They basically just don't come back. So if you want to take them down and do a really heavy prune, probably just plan on removing them and putting something else back in their place. Okay, so where to prune on a tree. You can see here you've got yeses and nos, right? So on the branch part that has been cut off, right at D, no, too far out, okay? That'll leave a dead area and that will die back and you might have insects that get into that. So you could have C there. You can see what we call the branch collar. That's the kind of ribbed area around the edge of the trunk. That's a big no also. You're too close to the trunk there and you're going to impact the tissue around there that would then cause the area to heal and form a callus. So the correct area is going to be where you see that dashed line for B. So it's just outside that branch collar area. And that is where you're going to prune so that you get a nice healed area on that tree and on a shrub. So pruning cuts, you want to leave that branch collar intact, of course. these pictures are a little bit easier. So you can see this is standard on a tree or on a shrub. It doesn't really matter. You're still, anytime you have a woody plant, this is how you need to do the cut. So the bigger the branch, of course, then you'll be using the 3-step method, because nobody wants a branch to rip off and fall on their head or damage their tree. So you do this, the 3-step method, instead. So if you have a small branch, you can just get your bypass pruners out, snip away from that branch collar area, and you'll be fine. But if it's a heavier one, you're going to do multiple cuts. You'll do a first cut underneath, and then you'll do the second cut further out to get that hefty, that weight off the end of the branch. And then your third cut's going to be closer to the actual trunk or bigger branch, excuse me, but outside the branch collar, so that it will heal properly. And you can see a picture off to the right of what the branch collar looks like. So this is what you do, and this guy's got a chainsaw. Excuse the fact it's an older picture, but it does a good job. So you're going to come up underneath and you're going to cut. That branch is very heavy. You've got a magnolia there. He's going to cut underneath like you see, and then you can see the branch starts to split. And then you're going to cut on top, and you're going to take off the weight of that branch so that it's easier to cut it off towards the branch collar. And then after you get the weight of that branch off, down in the lower left, you see he's gotten that weight off. Now he can come back and he can cut just outside that branch collar. And he hasn't ripped the bark or the tissue of that branch down to the branch collar. And so that tree will then heal nicely. And you see a bunch of really horrible pruning done by that old utility crew again. So you can see the top red arrow in the middle. The tree has attempted to heal and has done kind of an okay job. But on the right, that arrow, you can see it didn't heal very well. And same with the arrow to the left. That was not done correctly. These are all too far away from the trunk, and so the tree was not able to successfully heal. Got a lot of dead wood on there, and that's just a magnet for insects. This is closer to what it should look like. So this is a nicely healed area, and you can see how the tree is compartmentalized. This is properly done. So it's away from the branch collar, but not too far out. So this is a proper pruning that's been done, and the tree will then heal fairly nicely going forward. Now, some people will try to slap this stuff on. Don't. Trees are perfectly able to heal themselves. They don't need this wound paint. Just don't do it. It will actually heal slower, and it may get some disease-causing organisms, fungal spores, that kind of thing in there. Just don't use it. Spring versus summer flowering. I've talked a lot, so I got to speed up. So prune spring flowering plants after they bloom. So if they bloom in June, you're going to go in there and you're going to trim them up right after that. Prune summer flowering plants before new growth begins. So that would be February-ish where we are now. So the rule of thumb, this is the rule of thumb, for instance, crepe myrtles. So they're summer flowering. So you're going to prune them now. And prune after they bloom. So here's a list: azaleas, forsythias, oak leaf hydrangeas, flowering cherries, flowering quince, forsythias in there twice. We love it so much. I just put it in there twice. Pyracantha, gardenias, dogwoods, redbuds, rhododendrons, Bradford pears, although just get rid of the Bradford pears, wisterias, witch hazels, and wigilias. So if you prune them in the winter time, that's going to actually reduce or prevent flowering. So we don't want to do that. Azaleas, after they bloom, don't mess with them prior to that. Forsythias, I know a lot of people like to shape these guys into hedges. Please don't. They are meant, much like loropetalums, to just be wild and unwieldy looking and natural, not manicured hedges. There are other things like hollies that do much better at a hedge than these guys. Most hedges are meant to be not able to be seen through, so you would want an evergreen in place of something like this, which is deciduous, because they do have a stage where there's nothing on them. But the flowers come out now. I've seen some of them are starting to bloom, just like I'm seeing some of the daffodils coming out. But just don't prune these guys. They look so much better when they're allowed to just kind of grow and do their thing. Hydrangeas, there are a lot of different types of hydrangeas. I know some people, as I'd mentioned, they'll call us up and say, my hydrangeas aren't blooming. I don't know what's going on. And it's probably because they're either in the wrong spot, the wrong plant in the wrong place, or they're being pruned at the wrong time. And therefore they just don't have the correct, they can't bud out. So knowing what you have, and there's some really excellent infographics out there for identifying what type of hydrangeas you have so that you know when you need to prune them so that you can make sure that you get the beautiful blossoms that you're looking for. Summer flowering plants prune before spring growth begins. So crepe myrtles, glossy abelias, that's a good pollinator plant. Golden rain trees, rose of Sharon, nandinas, depending on the nandina. Not always a big fan. Just as a side note on nandina, if you have some older landscape plantings, you can prune these pretty heavily. Please make sure to take the berries off if you have firepower or one of the older varieties. Birds like them and they are somewhat invasive. Shrub roses, sweet shrub, beautyberries, glossy abelias. We like it so much, it's twice there too. Grandiflora roses, floribunda roses, butterfly bushes, spireas, chaste trees, tea olives, and camellias. These will bloom on new wood, so make sure you're pruning them right about now. Here's what a chaste tree looks like. These guys can be pruned into a tree shape, or they can be kept in kind of a shrub shape. Either way, I like them both. Pollinators like them. They're very pretty. So consider these. I think we've got these in our plant sale for sale. So if you're interested, our office has a yearly plant sale, and you can pre-order now through March 1st, and then pickup will be March 14th at the Gwinnett County Fairgrounds. You can check out the link on our website, UGA Extension Gwinnett. Crepe myrtles, if pruned properly, these are pruned properly. They look very pretty. And here's some hybrid roses, pruned correctly. You'll have a lot of pretty blooms on there. So pruning do's. Do plan every cut. I mentioned several times that it's kind of an artistic way of doing things. You want to prune out a little bit and then kind of take a step back and look at the plant, see how balanced it is. You always want to make sure that every cut is thought about. You want to prune to an outward facing bud. So obviously if you're going to prune, you don't want it to grow back into the bush. You want it to grow out. So make sure that when you're cutting back to a particular bud, it's a bud that faces out. And again, take a step back, look at it, and figure out, does that look good, or do I need to do a little bit more? And don't be like you were when you were 5 or 6 and cutting off your Barbie's hair. You can take too much off, so be very judicious and thoughtful in your process of when you're pruning. Pruning don'ts. Don't give haircuts. Don't do the old heading prune, as I mentioned. Don't leave stubs. Don't leave this much space above the node that you cut to. Make sure you're doing a proper cut. Don't use dull equipment. Again, I mentioned, make sure your equipment, whether it's an $80 pair of pruners or a $10 pair from Ace, keep the blades sharp and clean. Don't leave it out in the rain. Make sure you maintain your equipment, and don't prune everything into one shape. Sometimes a little bit of a natural shape looks great. We don't live in England, in the UK, so we don't really have the need for a formal garden. Some people have them. They look spectacular, but that's a lot of work. So understand that. And it's perfectly okay to have a bit more of a rambling landscape. Remember, right place, right plant in the right location. And pruning is very local. So, you don't have to, you can prune by judiciously removing a little bit here and there and change the overall look of the plant. So keep that in mind. And also in heading, it's only that 6 to 8 inches. Try to avoid doing that. Thinning cuts are best. Use that 3-cut method that we talked about when pruning trees. There are lots of videos, folks. So if you want someone to kind of walk you through the step, hit up YouTube. There's plenty of stuff out there. Or you can call us. We'll walk you through it too. Wound dressings, not necessary. Both trees and shrubs have the ability to heal themselves as long as the cut was done properly. So you don't need to buy a wound dressing. Prune spring flowering plants after bloom. And once again, keep your pruning tools sharp and clean. And that's all I got, folks. Hey, I only went 2 minutes long. All right, I'm going to unshare here. All right, so I think there's a couple questions in the chat here. Raymond says the link on the UGA website worked for me today. Yes, that's awesome. I was trying to work with some of our office folks to fix that. I suspected I knew what the problem might be, and so that must have been what it was. So I'm glad. What's a sucker? That's a very good question. So a lot of times when you have, let's say you had a big rainstorm, sometimes you get a flush of growth and you'll get these large, very vigorous branches that pop out of the side of a branch and just grow straight up. We've seen them on all sorts of different plants. It's not specific to any one type of plant. That can be construed as a sucker. And so when we're trying to shape a shrub or a small tree or something like that, usually suckers are not something we want. We want that tree or that bush to have a very nice shape, whatever it is that we've trained it into. And so when you get this one unwieldy, weird looking branch that just shoots up out of nowhere, we probably want to remove that, and that's okay. But anyway, that's what it is. It's just a branch that kind of, it's like you get a cowlick on your hair and it just kind of sticks straight up. That's the equivalent on a bush. Yes, when a plant grows from the root trunk of a plant. Should you prune boxwoods? So boxwoods, if you get some of the dwarf Korean varieties, they are naturally kind of a nice rounded shape. And they don't need a lot of pruning. So if somebody comes to me and says, we want some foundation plantings that we don't have to do a lot of maintaining to, that are relatively small, that's probably one of them that I am going to recommend. So obviously we have, boxwood blight in the area, and some of the English boxwoods, there are a lot more in Atlanta, fewer out here just because it's a newer section of the suburbs out here. But there are still some areas that are being maintained, and they still have very highly pruned and formal gardens. But normally you should not have to do that. Because their natural shape is going to be kind of that rounded air that a lot of people like in their foundation plantings. Thank you, thank you. Camellias bloom at the bottom third of the plant. Is that because I'm cutting off the new growth at the top? Possibly. Camellias naturally are very tall and don't require a lot of pruning except for some shaping. So the two kinds, we have the Sasanqua and the Japonica. Sasanqua is going to bloom later, like September, December-ish. Japonica is going to be kind of now. Some of them got a little frost nipped when we had some of those colder temperatures, but mine are blooming here at my house. And generally, I don't do a lot with them. I know some people kind of can try to put them into a hedge shape, and yes, if you're doing that, you're probably cutting off a lot of the blooms. I think of it more as a tall, very tall hedge. So you kind of prune it a little bit to get it where you want it, and then just leave it. And it's going to be a taller, as in I like 15 to 20 feet tall tree hedge, if you want to kind of look at it that way. It's not really super thick like a holly will be. Maybe you can put another holly in front of it if you've got annoying neighbors, but you're probably pruning a little bit too much. What is the problem with pruning it too steep in an angle? I tried to explain that a little bit. When you prune it too steep of an angle like that, um, sometimes you have the propensity of hitting a bud area. You want to have somewhat of an angle because that allows water to kind of roll off and any sap that might seep from that. But too steep like that, and you can actually impact the lower bud, among other things. And what are the little sticks jutting out? Yes, I didn't explain that very well. So when an ambrosia beetle is laying its eggs, it lays it underneath. So the trees and shrubs have what we call heartwood in the center, and that's not alive anymore. Those cells aren't. Really, the only living tissue is right underneath the bark. And so they're laying their eggs underneath there, and the larva of the ambrosia beetle kind of tunnels through back and underneath there, and it'll tunnel in there. And then as it tunnels in, and those grubs are eating the tissue of that tree, and then for lack of a glorious word, pooping, that's actually frass, F-R-A-S, I think one or two S's. But it's the poop of the larva, and it comes out and it looks like a toothpick. So that's an indication that you have ambrosia beetles that are in there. Some people, when they know the beetles were really bad the year before, they know it might be an issue, they might actually spray a pesticide on the trunk of that tree in the hopes that it will keep the beetles away. Some fruit tree owners will do that, but you can, so it's not necessarily going to kill the tree. Sometimes if you get a super heavy infestation, yes, it will. Once about 50% of the area behind that bark area or the cambium area is destroyed, that tree or that shrub doesn't have enough circulatory system and moving nutrients up and down to stay alive. So it will start to go in decline, and then it will die. So a lot of people who maybe had figs last year and didn't notice those toothpicks, I've already had a couple calls where they said that the branches are now breaking off. It's dead wood essentially, and they didn't notice it last year, or they noticed the toothpicks but didn't know what it was. And now those branches are dying because it hit maximum capacity, and they went 60%, 70% of the beetle larva had burrowed through that area and killed off that tissue underneath. Basically, it'd be the same as somebody crimped off a blood vessel in you, or actually, if they put a can't remember the name of so like if you're bleeding out and they put the tourniquet, there you go, around you. Well, if they didn't remove that tourniquet, your arm would die. The tissue would die from lack of blood. That's what's happening here. So that's just an indication that you have that beetle in there. Is there a location that we can get our tools sharpened? Ace Hardware, sometimes they'll sharpen your lawnmower blades. And I think they will also sharpen your pruners and your other stuff like that. So that for sure I know of. Maybe some of the other garden centers might do that, but I would reach out to your local Ace because I do know that they do it there. When do you prune encore azaleas? So that's a good question. You're probably going to be missing out on one season of blooming if that's the case. So if they are unwieldy and rather large, prune, you're gonna miss out on one season is all I can say. So kind of pick, I guess, if you don't care if they bloom later in the season, then maybe allow them to bloom in the first part and then go ahead and prune then. but I can definitely look that up. So if you want to email me, I provided my email earlier. I don't get a lot of call for pruning encores for whatever reason. So I apologize for kind of a half answer there. Does anybody have any other questions for me before I end for the evening? Okay, going once, going twice. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And this will show up on the Metro Master Gardener channel. Metro Master Gardener next week, and YouTube. And if you are curious and you want to go check out some of the other stuff I have, just email me or email the office and I can give you the address for that. But have a good evening, and thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Great job. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming. Bye.